How to set up your camera for wedding photography? Simple question, right? But it isn't that simple because light conditions change continuously. So what is the best setting? Therefore I divided this video in different light conditions so you can go to the right chapter and you know exactly what to do, what kind of settings you need for every light condition. And in case you don't know me, my name is Roy. I shot more than 1,000 weddings, been a professional photographer for a lot of years, and I'm going to help you with the correct settings for every light setting you can imagine. So let's dive into those camera settings and make sure you get the perfect lighting. So first we have to lay down a baseline for sharp, clear images. And before we lay down a baseline, I have to give a disclaimer. This video is about the basic settings, light settings for every lighting setting possible on a wedding. It's not about creative shots, pro expert kind of thing, just a base level of camera settings for wedding photography, for beginner photographers or photographers who want to refresh their memories and check if they're still using the right settings. If you're an advanced photographer, you probably don't watch this video, or maybe you want to watch this video because you like it with Uncle Roy here in my living room. But I do have one chapter with some creative light ideas, not too difficult, easy to follow, for great results, even for a beginner photographer, and great to do on weddings. So a simple wedding day formula is: keep your ISO as low as possible. Keep your shutter speed fast enough so things are sharp and your aperture wide open so you get a very beautiful depth of field. And a little bonus, use AV mode on your camera, because AV mode is a real lifesaver on weddings. If you're curious about how it works, I'll put a video in the description below about how to use AV mode as a photographer. I still use it as a, well, they call me a pro photographer, but it really helps. It's no shame in using AV mode, and especially if you try it out, you'll understand how great this mode is. Let's start with harsh midday sun. You may or may not have heard of the Sony 16 rule. The rule basically states that if you have a clear sunny day and your aperture is at f16, whatever ISO you're using, your shutter speed will be the receptacle value of the ISO value. If ISO is X, then 1/X seconds is your shutter speed. By now I'm pretty sure you lost me. So let's make it very simple. If you have a wedding ceremony in very hard sunlight and you set up your camera in this way, you will have perfect lighting. So that means f16, and if your ISO is 200, your shutter speed has to be 200. But I also told you that you have to keep your aperture as wide open as you can. And f16 isn't wide open, it's pretty closed. So we have to change the numbers around a bit. And the way you do it is with stops. Now I'm not gonna bother you with how stops work. It's a calculation formula for photography. Therefore I recalculated it so you can use it on your camera in the sun, no problems, using the right correct f16 rule. So that means if you go down to f3.5, you can use a ISO of 100 and a shutter speed of 2000. And you have the same settings as a f16 rule. Dimly lit churches and wedding venues, maybe the worst kind you can get. So when wedding photographers are talking about prime lenses, these conditions are perfect for prime lenses because you can lower your f-stop. You can go down to 1.2 or 1.4 and you have enough light. But not all lenses have that capability, and especially if you're starting out, you won't have a lens that can do it, so you have to change it around a bit. The most important thing you do is to open up your aperture as wide as possible. If you have camera or lens stabilization, definitely use it because you're going to need it in the low light conditions. So the settings I use when people are eating or not moving around a lot in these kind of conditions would be f1.4, shutter speed 80 and ISO 1600. And if you don't have a lens that can do that, for instance you have a lens that only can go down to f2.8, which is still fine, the settings are as followed: f2.8, 1/80 of a second, ISO 6400. Mixed lighting and LED color casts. So it goes without saying that you always shoot RAW, never shoot JPEG. Because in some cases, like this example, it's impossible to correct your photos if you're shooting JPEG, especially with color casts going around in your photos. So some Lightroom adjustments will be necessary to correct your photos. In these conditions, it's always important to check your white balance. So your white balance is the most close to the natural light being around you. And you will discover that sometimes it just isn't possible. Even I have those moments and I'm like, I don't know what the white balance is. There's so much color. That's no problem. Because you're using RAW, you can adjust it after the wedding in Lightroom. So if you want to really push the color cast away, the only way to really do it is with a flash or a light to really push the color cast away. If you don't have a flash or a light with you, the best thing to do is Photoshop or Lightroom. If it's an extreme color cast, so like a full magenta or a full blue, you can't really correct it with the white balance because it's outside the white balance and tint spectrum. So you really have to go to Lightroom to fix it. In my description below there's a video on how to fix every color cast, because every color cast is fixable as long if you are using raw files. That's very important. But with those colored lights, also dark spots come in play, because often there are like light spots with different colors and in between it's very dark. So you've probably seen the settings, it's like a theater or something like that, and it just looks horrible. So the most important thing is to focus on the brightest part of the photo, because the brightest part can never be overexposed. Rather underexpose the dark part than overexpose the light part. So for settings that don't involve movement, I use these settings. Aperture 1.8, shutter 100, aperture 3200. But that is for people sitting still, don't move around a lot. If people are dancing, you will be forced to use a flashlight, because if you don't use a flashlight or speed light, it almost becomes impossible to create sharp, clear images. Backlit scenes, like windows. And a lot of photographers struggle with windows, people standing in front of windows, because the people get backlit, and it is difficult. It's always a choice between, do I want to see what's behind the window or do I want to see what's in front of the window? Put your camera in spot metering mode. So the camera only measures the part in the middle of the shot. So if your wedding couple's in the middle, it will only measure that part of the photo, and not the light around the subject. And that's very important, because the contrast is so high, the camera really can't adjust and you have to do it manually. So important is that you keep your ISO as low as possible for the optimum quality of your photo. Your aperture between 1.2 to 2.8 for separation of your subject, or 4 to 5.6 if you want more background detail, depending on what the background is. Your brightness is controlled by the shutter speed, so that can depend from 200 up to 2000, somewhere in between. It depends on the amount of brightness you need for your photo. And you can set your white balance to automatic, or if you set it to 5000 to 6500, you're fine. So a little tip, if you use a reflector or even a soft little flash, you can really balance out the subject in front of you. So you can lower down your light for the backlit part and light up the part in front of you. You can use a light bouncer or you can use a flash to do this. But if you really want to do it the right way, just use the window as your light source and don't shoot against the window. As a photographer, stand in front of the window and your subject is towards the window, you'll have way better images. So what about very low light? And we're thinking about candles, string lights, low ambient lights. Well, this is actually the same as the dim lit situation. It's low light and only with some light spots. The difference is that there's no different colors, mostly orange kind of tints. So a trick could be to use your tripod to make your images more stable, or if you have a very good stabilizer in your lens or camera, you can shoot handheld depending on your camera. I use R5s and they are very good at low shutter speeds. So the settings I use for people that don't move around that much is 1.4. I know that's low. 1/80th of a second, ISO 1600. If you don't have a light sensitive lens, you can go to 2.8, 1/80th of a second and ISO 6400. So what about overcast and flat light? So when is it overcast? When you're walking outside and you don't have a shadow around you, then the light is flat. I love that flat light, by the way. So for overcast you have a f8 rule and an f5.6 rule. All those rules. F8 is for some clouds with a little bit of shade on the ground, and f5.6 is when there is no shade around you. The settings for heavy overcast is 5.6, 1/200th of a second, ISO 200. So if it's f8, your settings are 1/200 and ISO 200. But again, they're very high in aperture and we want low aperture. So I changed it around a little bit for you. And for the heavy overcast, f2.8, 1/1600th of a second and ISO 200. f2.8, 1/400th, ISO 200. So a slight tip, if you overexpose a little bit, you get a more brighter skin tones, and skin tones will look better in post-processing. Patterned lights, like window shades or tree leaves, those are the worst. They're quite complex. So I always say, don't stand under leaves. I would just avoid them completely. If it's not controlled, don't use it. If it's a controlled environment, you could use it. But if you want to make clear, bright photos, best thing to avoid. Just look for a place that has a full shade and the images will look way better. But if you shoot a patterned, because there's no option, then these are the settings. ISO 200 between 800, depending on how much light there is. The aperture between 2.8 and 5.6, depending on the group you're shooting. If it's a bigger group, you're using 5.6. Smaller group, you can use 2.8. Shutter speed between 200 and 500, because especially with group photos, you want a higher shutter speed so you know everyone is very sharp in the photo. And then the most fun part, creative light. Yay! Some creativity at last, because those other settings are quite boring. I want to encourage you to try stuff out and try some cool stuff with your camera out, and not do it in post-process, do it in your camera, because you can do so much cool stuff with your camera. Therefore, I have some cool light settings you can use with your camera and the light around you to make an interesting shot. First, the ECM, intentional camera movement. So you keep your ISO between 100 and 400, the aperture between f8, f16 to prevent overexposure of your low shutter speed, because your shutter speed will be between 115 and 130th. So there's a very low shutter speed. So make sure you throw your aperture up, and you need it for some sharpness. And the technique is very simple. Move the camera while you're taking the shot. Twist, tilt, pan or shake. So when you make a shot, twist your camera and you get a very cool effect. Second, twisty light tails. Already sounds really cool. The effect creates a circular light pattern around your subject, but you need a long exposure to get the effect. That's with a lot of light effects, you need longer exposures. So again, your ISO between the 100 and 400, your aperture between f9, f16, depending on how much light you need, and your shutter speed between 0.5 and 2 seconds, depending on the light. And then to make sure when you shoot a photo, there's a light source in your shot, and then twist your camera, and you'll get a round shape of the light in your shot. And the third effect is a zoom burst. It's like a warp speed light trails. So I can't do this effect because I only use prime lenses, but if you have a zoom lens, you can use it. It's really cool. So for this effect, you will need the following settings. ISO between 100 and 400, your aperture between f8 and f16, and shutter speed between 115 and 130th of a second. So while you're taking a photo, you simultaneously zoom your lens. So you take a photo and zoom your lens, and you get a warp speed effect that really looks cool. So I can imagine you still have a lot of questions. So if you want more help, you can become a member of my channel. You can get one-on-one help, or you have made the most beautiful photos, but you find it very difficult to color grade. You can find my Lightroom presets in the description, and they're very accessible and very simple with a manual that makes the preset looks like it's your own preset. And of course you can ask some questions in the comments below, because comments are good for the video. So this was it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.